Hey there and welcome back to another Pixar video. And recently I've been enduring a crippling case of childhood nostalgia and was reminiscing about my fond memories of watching Toy Story and Toy Story 2 in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And like many of you I'm sure, I was once Andy. I loved taking my toys and having them go on grand adventures or doing battle with each other, building Lego castles and raising kingdoms. Just all of that childhood goodness. And so for me, the first two Toy Story films hold a really special place in my heart and really bring me back to that sense of childhood wonder. And honestly, those two as a standalone tell a really great story. Toy Story 1, the tale of two alpha toys who were forced into coexisting. For years, Woody's been the head of the toy household. For years, he's been the favourite of their owner, Andy. And for years, he's been played with the most and is central to all the storylines that Andy comes up with for his toys. And over time, his jealousy towards Buzz manifests in arguments and even violence, before the two are able to reconcile and form a very strong bond. Pretty much a parable of a younger sibling joining the family and all the feelings that come along with that, including the older sibling feeling jealous and the younger one feeling lonely and rejected. And of course, this comes alongside exciting action, heartfelt scenes of friendship and love, and some of the freakiest, most nightmare-inducing toys of all time. Baby head with spider legs, I'm looking at you. Seriously, this freak haunted my dreams for years. Even now, I still get nervous when I have to look under my bed in case this monster is there. And it has been over 20 years since I first saw it. Ugh. Seriously, why the hell would they include this thing in a children's film? It honestly would not feel out of place in some of the worst, most frightening horror movies. And then when it latches onto Sid's head, ugh. I actually have goosebumps just talking about it. And then we come to Toy Story 2, which in my opinion only served to improve upon the formula set up in Toy Story 1. All the best parts of Toy Story 1 are still there. Fun action, well-developed characters, hilarious scenes, randomly devastating sad flashback montage songs. And featuring a humorous and also somewhat deranged look into the world of collector toys as its main overarching storyline, the film also manages to interweave this with an emotional look at abandonment and how it scars you, as well as finding a way to fill that void. And really, for a film about toys, it is ridiculously deeply layered. And so, when I first heard they were making a third one to complete the set, so to speak, I was not particularly interested. I was not hyped at all. I thought the second one left off the story quite perfectly, and the third installment was just too much of a risk. That it would tarnish the legacy left behind by the first two installments. That it would take a nice warm and steamy shit all over my childhood nostalgia and ruin all my happy memories of the movies. And then I went and saw the film, and damn, I couldn't have been more wrong. Because honestly, Toy Story 3 is the perfect send-off to Buzz, Woody, and the rest. It's the story of toys that were once so happy and fulfilled, who had a child that loved and cherished them, but had been left to gather dust in the attic or under the bed, that saw that the child they'd known and loved for so long had grown up in the blink of an eye and no longer really needed them around anymore. He only held on to them for that feeling of childhood nostalgia that the films inspire. And man, side note, I really feel Andy in this movie. Anytime I come across an old toy I haven't played with since I was a kid, I get this sick feeling of guilt for not playing with toys anymore. But then also for considering throwing them out at all. Because even though I know for a fact that toys are inanimate objects, these goddamn films have somehow convinced me that deep down, if I get rid of them, it would hurt their feelings. It's truly insane what these movies can do. But anyway, let's get back on topic. And like I said, Toy Story 3 took a franchise that didn't really need a third installment, a franchise that felt complete with just two, and made it so that it would forever feel incomplete if the third one was suddenly taken away. It perfectly capped off Woody's journey and Buzz's journey and Andy's journey. Their arcs felt complete. It felt like the end of an era. Bittersweet in that it was over, but it also just felt right seeing Andy drive off into the sunset and seeing the toys settle down with Bonnie. With the implication being that the cycle would probably begin anew. She'd eventually grow and pass on the toys. The toys would mostly stay together, plus or minus a few stragglers that get left behind or added, and would stay until Bonnie no longer needs them, and on it goes. A cycle Woody has probably endured before, considering his show was on, in the 50s? He's an old toy by this point. And really, that's where the story hits its natural ending. Instead of embracing bitterness like Lotso, they stick together and take what life has to throw at them. They endure, and it just feels like a cross between a love letter to childhood as well as a farewell to childhood. And that is where you'd think the story would end, until the announcement of Toy Story 4. And just like when Toy Story 3 was announced, my initial gut reaction was to think, another one? Why would they make this? They don't need a fourth. But then I remembered just how wrong I'd been about Toy Story 3 and thought to myself, shut up, you're wrong. It'll be great, just like all the others. And then I watched it. And I'll preface my complaints with this. Toy Story 4 is a good film. In fact, it's a great film. It succeeds on basically every front. It looks good, the audience scores are good, the critical scores are good, it earned a lot of money, won a lot of awards. And yet, I can't help but think that this is actually the one that tarnishes the legacy of the first three. It feels like the weak link, like it's the odd one out of the four. And in many ways, it doesn't even feel connected to the others, because whilst it utilizes many of those same characters, the tone feels very different, and not in a good way. In Toy Story 1, 2, and 3, the thing that really guides Woody is that feeling of togetherness, that feeling of needing to be with his family of toys. Yes, they love Andy, and a big part of the story is them coming to terms with his growth and progression through his childhood and into his adult life, but it always comes down to the family he's built. In Toy Story 1, Woody realizes that in his selfish desire to be the most loved toy by Andy, he's damaged the family bonds and thus needs to go to Sid's house to bring back Buzz. In Toy Story 2, when he's stolen by Al, he debates staying to become part of the collection with Jessie, Stinky Pete and Bullseye, but ultimately decides that his life needs to be devoted to the child he loves and the family that he's built with all these other toys. And then, in Toy Story 3, when he has the opportunity to ride off into the sunset with Andy like a true old Western film, he decides to stay and dedicate his life to a new child alongside his beloved family. So for him to pull a 180 during the events of Toy Story 4 and decide he's going to leave his family and become a nomadic toy alongside Bo Peep, largely due to the fact that Bonnie doesn't really want to play with him anymore, well, suffice to say it didn't sit right with me based on what he'd been like in the previous films. And don't get me wrong, I'm not against the idea itself, just the execution of it. Because we've had 3 movies of one sort of thing. 3 movies of him deciding that no matter what his personal feelings are, he's going to stay with his family because they need him and they love him. Now, if they'd had something like this happen during Toy Story 3, I would have understood. It would have fit the theme of Toy Story 3 a lot better, because Woody would see an abandoned toy gone wrong in Lotso, and he'd see what happens when you feel abandoned by your owner. He saw it in Jessie, he sees it again in Lotso. It would have made sense if at the end, his family ended up donating to the daycare and he ends up choosing to follow them. And it would have been a very similar ending to Toy Story 4, in that instead of devoting their life to one child, they devote themselves to every child that walks through those doors. And it would have felt more clean in my opinion. But instead, the vibe I got from Toy Story 4 was that for the first time ever, he's not the most, or at least the second most popular toy, and he can't handle it. And then he gets heavily bullied by Bo Peep until he becomes convinced that being a lost toy and wandering the world is the best path for him. And he leaves his entire family, except for Bo Peep, forever. And in a way, I think it ends up wrecking the ending of Toy Story 3 for him by following this path. Because at the end of 3, you have that big turning point, the big decision. Does he risk it by going with Andy and staying with the kid he loved for so long, but leave his family behind? Or does he stay with his family of toys he built up and dedicate his heart to a new owner in Bonnie? And then this leads to that heart-wrenching so long partner moment at the end. But then within months, he ditches out because he feels neglected, and suddenly he has a new purpose? And then they basically repeat the ending of 3, except this time with Buzz and Woody. But bizarrely, it feels less emotional to me because we've seen it before. But then on top of that, now the ending of 3 kind of feels meaningless. It feels like it was cheapened somehow, like it wasn't really unique. And like what it represents was completely tossed in the bin for the sake of a new story. And look, in the end, this is not keeping me up at night crying about how they've ruined my precious franchise. And it's not like Toy Story 4 is actually bad. It is good, but I just feel like it missed the mark in terms of that emotional connection. And in doing so, it cheapened the emotional impact of the other films, particularly 3, because ultimately, you now know that one day, Woody's gonna skip out on that family to run off into the sunset with his girlfriend that he hasn't seen in years. And they decide this in what, like a day? Seems a bit rash to me. Hopefully he doesn't end up regretting it. But anyway, those are just my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think of Toy Story 4? Think it fits well with the universe? Or do you think it could have been handled better? I'm aware that this may be an unpopular opinion, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.